What's up, everybody? It's the Digital World Podcast, and they're gonna gaslight people when starts to become something in regards to an issue like climate change. While there is a lot going on, you have to be able to kind of sift through all the junk that they're telling you. One thing that I learned from watching, one of Georgia Gammon's podcasts was how to determine whether an agenda is just a power grab towards totalitarian control. And it's if there's no clear objectives and the dates they give are so far out that it's hard to no one knows what can happen, in the next 15, 20, 30, 40 years. So things like the net zero carbon emissions, like what is a woman, like all the terrorism. How do you? There's no clear objectives, and just a perpetual war or perpetual agenda that's happening. And this is Al Gore talking about the climate change agenda. So let him do the talking.
The climate deniers are really, in some ways, similar to all of those almost 400 law enforcement officers in Uvalde, Texas, who were waiting outside an unlocked door while the children were being massacred. They heard the screams, they heard the gunshots, and nobody stepped forward. And God bless those families who suffered so much. And law enforcement officials tell us that's not typical of what law enforcement usually does. And confronted with this global emergency, what we're doing with our inaction and failing to walk through the door and stop the killing is not typical of what we are capable of as human beings. You know,
So, and he's been a huge proponent of climate change. So, folks, they're gonna want people to give up a lot, everything, their own individuality, just for this agenda. Now, here is another. Check this out.
This country, George, there's a big emphasis on agriculture and how agriculture needs to cut its emissions. And I know it's an issue you feel very strongly about. You've said that agriculture is arguably the most destructive industry on earth. Explain, and do you still believe that, George?
It's by far and away the greatest cause of habitat destruction, the greatest cause of wildlife loss, the greatest cause of extinction, greatest cause of soil loss, greatest source of freshwater use. It's one of the greatest causes of climate breakdown, bigger than transport, one of the primary causes of water pollution and of air pollution. So it's right at the top. Oh, and sorry, I forgot to say land use, the biggest issue of all. It's by far and away the greatest form of land use that humans inflict on the planet, which means all that land is land which can't be used for wild ecosystems. And while obviously we need farming, we need to minimize those impacts. We need to
So, starve to death, essentially.
act as drastically within that sector as any other sector to prevent the collapse of our life support systems. And what that means, above all else, is getting out of livestock farming, is really shutting down animal farming altogether, because that has massively disproportionate impacts on the living planet. And we need to switch towards other sources of food, plant-based diets, which are far more efficient, far lower environmental impacts, but also switch out of farming altogether to produce protein-rich foods, which we can do through precision fermentation, brewing
George,
microbes.
I can hear farmers all over this small country of ours shocked and perhaps screaming at their televisions because they're saying, are you saying all animal farming, in your opinion, really needs to stop?
Yes, it does. It really does. It's a bit like leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Unless we do that, we've really got very little chance indeed of preventing this domino effect of system collapse right across Earth systems, which basically makes the planet uninhabitable. So eating meat and milk and eggs is an indulgence we cannot afford.
So there's a lot to unpack here, but you got to be very careful with some of these ideas. You're seeing what's happening across the globe where they're limiting the use of fertilizer or nitrogen, etc., which is going to impact the crop yield dramatically. Folks, they're trying to make people go through a famine so they can bend the knee and submit to whatever the government says. And this is where it's all going. And it's a slippery slope to perdition. Here is another protest video that's happening in Panama. And the, when people can't afford fuel or food, they take it to the streets and bad things happen. And it's just complete anarchy, right? You gotta be careful. And all these peripheral nations are feeling the crunch. And that's usually what happens in this. And later, you know, chicken comes home to roost. And it's going to come here to the US. Maybe not to the extent that you see in these third world countries, but it's going to feel dramatic to the average American. So, anyways, thank you for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel. This is the Digital World Podcast, and I'll see you in the next episode.